Moving to our second respondent, I'm very interested in what Professor Collier has to say. Professor Collier has spoken on development for years. He's a world acknowledged expert on development and on Africa. And recently, actually, very interesting, has made a comment on yet another model, the Norway model. Professor Collier has written that it's a mistake for developing countries to follow the quote-unquote Norway model with stored accumulations of national wealth in sovereign wealth funds. And his argument is that the vast accumulation that Norway has, for instance, with a sovereign wealth fund of approximately $573 billion, has been made possible because Norway has already invested more per capita in its citizens, and 5 million citizens with $573 billion of sovereign wealth fund, has invested more per capita in citizens than any other country in the world. And developing countries need to invest in their own people before sovereign wealth funds. Now, this is an issue we'll come back to later, and I don't think it's that different from what the governor and the ambassador have said. But having said that, I'll let Professor Collier speak for himself. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's late, and so I'll be brief. I'm also very conscious that I'm not an African, and this is quite properly an African event. The one thing I can bring is independence, right? Oxford University pays me to think whatever I like, and that's what I do. That said, I found myself in very much in agreement with the two speakers. That Governor Sanusi, his central theme was the importance of transformation, moving an economy on from being dependent on natural resource extraction to becoming a modern economy. And the essence of a modern economy is that there's a dense array of activities which are independent and have scale economies. Interdependence and scale. That's what modernity is about. That's what prosperity is about. And you're at the moment stuck in an economy that has neither of those features. Natural resources are an enclave activity, and it's not a scale economies activity. Quite the opposite. You're going to run out of them. They're an unsustainable activity. And so I think the governor's absolutely right in stressing it's that process of transformation. If you don't transform, you're not developing. Now, I also find myself very much in agreement with Ambassador Garatu. And let me start with agreeing with him that forget all this development models, right? Absolutely right, right? My heart sank when I saw that title, just like you, sir, that it's not a choice of Model A or Model B. Societies are much more sophisticated than Model A or Model B, and they're also very different from one another. And so the ambassador is absolutely right. These are internal processes which differ from one society to another. They're internal dynamics that make some societies rise to prosperity and others not. And finally, I agree with him very much that attitudes matter enormously. That my diagnosis of a lot of Africa's problems is actually the same as his, that it's been the failure to build a sense of national identity and national unity. And Eritrea's singularly not been part of that failure. You've built a sense of nationhood, a few African leaders did just that, but many didn't. And it's really hard to develop without a sense of nationhood. So attitudes matter. So now let me get down. I'm an economist and I'm not an African, so let me try and say something that is helpful about an economy without being, without pretending to be you. And let me come down to this business of the transformation from a natural resource extraction to becoming a modern diversified economy. And here, you're not China and you're not Norway. Right? You're not China because China didn't develop on a base of starting from natural resource extraction. it developed in a very, very different pattern. It broke in to an opportunity for cheap labour manufacturing at a time when nobody else was doing it. And Governor Sanusi is absolutely right that for the last 30 years, that option's been closed off to Africa because China was so competitive. Now, China is at last reaching the stage where it's not going to be competitive because wages are rising so fast. You know? Until now, China's been hyper-competitive because competitivity depended upon two things: cheap labour and clusters of activity. You know, one of my favourite analogies for understanding modern manufacturing is buttons. Right, 2/3 of the world's buttons are made in one city, right, which 30 years ago used to be a village. Why are 2/3 of the world's buttons made in one city? It's not that there's mega button incorporated there, right? And it's not that if you scratch the soil in Kai Tao, there's buttons underneath it. It's just that by clustering together, a lot of small button firms lower each other's costs. And so China has these clusters, right? Zips, it's even more pronounced than buttons, right? That's modern manufacturing. And so breaking into that is really hard. And breaking in, if you don't even have cheaper labour, is absolutely impossible. And you need pump priming. You need pump priming, right? I mean, the pump priming that I've been trying to get going to launch Africa into manufacturing is protection of Africa by America and Europe against China. Because I believe it's possible to break into European and American markets, but only if Europe and America give Africa privileged market access. And America does that to some extent. Europe does it, but it does it very badly. Right? And we need that. We need the devil in all trade policies in the detail, and we need those trade policies redesigned so that they actually work. Right? Let me see, you're not China, but nor are you Norway, for exactly the reason that, as it were, China has just proposed, right? That it now makes sense for Norway to acquire capital in Brazil, which is what it's doing. But it only makes sense because it's already got more invested capital per member of the labour force than any other country on earth. You've got less. And so copying Norway with these sovereign wealth funds invested in Brazil will be crazy for you. You're going to have a huge opportunity the next decade of big revenues coming from natural resource extraction. That is an unsustainable development. Right? The valuable natural resources will run out or they'll fall in price because of technological innovation. So you've got a window of basically one generation. This generation is the generation that has the responsibility for using those unsustainable revenues to transform Africa from a natural resource economy into a developed economy. And it's a huge opportunity and it's a huge responsibility. You know, in Nigeria, a previous generation had that opportunity and did not seize it, right? With all the rent seeking that the governor described. Right? So we know the default option. The default option is repeat that disastrous history. And so the challenge, both for Nigerians and a lot of Africans, is to avoid repeating that history. It's not inevitable that you repeat history. Let me give you an economic question. What's the best run economy in Europe today? And it's not this one. Germany, obviously, right? Now the hard question. Why is Germany the best run economy in Europe? Why? And let me tell you, because it used to be the worst. Yes, that's the honest answer, right? If you go back 3 generations, Germany was the only country in Europe which messed its economy up so disastrously that they went into hyperinflation, right? Disaster. And Germans came out of that with a searing sense of never again. Now, Africans have got that Africa's problem is different. It's not hyperinflation. It's avoiding the plunder of your natural resources. But across Africa, there's that burning sense of never again. We don't want to repeat plunder. Right? And so it is, I think, it's interesting to learn from Germany, what did the Germans actually do to make never again a practical reality? The details are going to be completely different because hyperinflation isn't your problem. Right? But the generic approach, I think, is of interest. And Germany did three things to make that never again a reality. One is they legislated rules, economic rules for decisions. Right? Your decision chain is going to be quite different, but starting with some legal rules is not a bad idea. Ghana, just last year, put in into the constitution that at least 30% of the revenues from oil had to be saved for the future, not just spent on the present. It's a good start. Put it in the constitution, right? Rules are not enough, right? Because sometimes the rules are not obeyed. Right? You don't have to look to Africa to believe that. Let's look right here in Europe, right? There's something called the euro, right? Which, Governor, I agree with you. Some things should be left to the next generation, and the Afro maybe should be learn from the euro. The euro has the euro has two rules, two fiscal rules. Right? There are 17 member countries, and two fiscal rules. And it's had 11 years. Do you know how many countries have not broken those rules in 11 years? Oh no, one. Not Germany. Finland, right? They're either very good or very dumb, right? So rules are not enough, right? They're all, those 17 countries, they'd all pride themselves on being, properly governed, not like Africa, but they've all broken the rules, right? So rules are not enough, right? You've got to make sure that the rules are enforced. And the first line of defense with rules is to get some dedicated institutions. If you're fighting hyperinflation, you need an independent central bank. If you're trying to harness your natural resources for the future, that's not the key institution, but you do need some dedicated institutions. And then rules and institutions are not enough. The final thing that underpinned good economic policy in Germany was neither the rules nor the institutions. It was having a critical mass of citizens who understood why the rules and why the institutions mattered, and therefore defended them. And 3 generations on, they're still doing just that, right? And that's the challenge for Africa. To avoid a repetition of the plunder of your natural resources, you need the constitutional rules, you need the dedicated institutions, and above all, you need a critical mass of citizens who understand what those things are for, right? Is that feasible? Yes, it is. Right? And this is where North Africa is so exciting, that young people learned how to use the new information technology to get up to speed on issues and to coordinate amongst themselves. Right? And that's the model. Right? Let me close with just a couple. I'll focus on one decision. There's a whole chain of decisions in harnessing natural resources. But let me focus on the final decision in the chain. If you want to read about the whole decision chain, there's a thing called the Natural Resource Charter, which I've been involved in, which lays out that decision chain. Google naturalresourcecharter.org, up it'll pop. Right? It's a flagship program of NEPAD, so it's fully African owned. But the final set of decisions in that whole chain of decisions concerns how you invest domestically. Because yes, you've got to be able to tax the natural resources off those resource extraction companies. You've got to save a sensible amount, but finally, you've got to invest it within the country, and the question is how. And for that, you need to build the capacity to invest properly, something that the ambassador spoke about. Build your domestic capacities, and what you need capacity for is to be able to make good investment choices. And building that capacity takes, takes time, takes effort. If you don't build your capacity and you try and spend a lot of money on investment, you know what you get? You get the cement armada. Now, even in this audience, a lot of people don't know what the cement armada was, but I'm sure the people of a certain age, like mine, know what it was, right? An attempt to build a lot of infrastructure, but really without the capacity to do it properly, and so hugely wasteful. Right? Those of you, under a certain age, ask your parents about the cement armada. Right? So building that capacity to invest well, and again, that requires some institution or institutions to be the home of that capacity. And so what I favour is not sovereign wealth funds, where the capacity in the wealth fund is to invest abroad. I favour what I call sovereign development funds, where the key capacity is the capacity to invest at home. Where should that sovereign development fund be lodged? My own preference, I have to say, is a central bank. On that note, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're now in our interactive phase. Obviously, the challenge when you have very interesting discussions like this is you generally run over time. So we have run over time somewhat, but I would still like to ensure that we have a little bit of interactive discussion between our panelists, and then we'll take questions and answers. My first question really is for all the members, all our speakers and respondents. And it's regarding the last thing that, or one of the last things that Professor Collier said, which is rules are not enough, you need institutions, but most importantly, a critical mass of citizens who understand the rules and the institutions and that they matter. And that goes back to what the ambassador was saying about attitude. And that, in turn, goes back to what the governor was saying, which is you look at Nigeria, you look at the challenges we have, the practical realities of the things we need to get done, the vested interests that are in place. You need a huge amount of political will. And that political will cannot just be imposed from the top down, but also has to come bottom up, as you've said, like we've seen in North Africa. So the question is, and I would like to start with the governor and then our respondents as well, is how do we create that attitude? Whether it be at the political level or at the level of the average person or the level of the student, how do we create the attitude?
Okay, thank you very much, China. Well, I'd like to, first of all, I think, just introduce my own slight amendment to that position on rules and institutions, to say that individuals remain important. I've had this debate with people. I've heard people say, well, Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions. Well, the reality is no matter how strong institutions are, they can be destroyed by men. And so it's important to have the right men. And I'll give you a few examples of how this works, and that's why civil society becomes important. Let's take the most current issue we have of the campaign for the presidency of the World Bank. Okay, now we do have from Africa a very strong candidate, and we do have from Latin America a very strong candidate. And we do know that the way the institutions work, such that if the United States has a candidate and it's backed by Europe, they have the votes. In spite of that, President Obama nominates a man that you cannot say is not competent. He's gone to Harvard, he's got a PhD in Harvard, he's got development experience, he's from Korea. It's a joker. I mean, there's no way, yes, he could win because he's got American votes, but no one can say Dr. Kim is not competent to be president of the World Bank. Okay, so you've got institutions, but how do they work? And I'll give you now one example of my country and how we can, how, for instance, and you probably understand this. We have a constitution that says we need a minister from every state. Fantastic. Okay, but why do we get the best from each state to be minister? No. So the law is there, and it's supposed to address the questions of ambassador, of having social justice. Every part of the country is supposed to feel participate. What happens? The president writes the governor and says, give me nominees, or the party. And the governor usually chooses one of the most useless human beings in his party, because his concern is he does not want to send in a competent minister who can come and contest for his seat. So the country ends up with a bunch of lemons, okay, who were selected mainly, I'm not saying all of them, and I have a respect for quite a few, but mainly selected, okay, and their greatest claim to glory is that they do not have any potential for being a threat to their governors. In other words, the people with the least potentials for leadership. Now the country suffers. So you've got the institutions, you've got the rules, but they don't work because we do not yet in our, and that's where attitude comes in, we do not yet in our hierarchy of what is important, it's a hierarchy of values. Merit does not rank up there. Okay, we talk about federal character, and that's fine. And when we talk about diversity, we talk about states or ethnic groups. We're talking about women, for example. It's not an important issue. Okay, so until we get to a point where we understand that it is the quality of the human beings combined with the quality of the rules that will lead to success, and until we give as much priority to quality as we do to diversity, we're not going to move forward. So that I think is the issue for me.
So, Ambassador, just to follow up on what the governor said, I mean, it comes back to what we're saying. Attitudes. We don't value merit. You are in a position where at least you have something, not quite a blank slate, but at least you're in the position where you can create things. So, in your opinion, how do we get these attitudes right?
In the first place, because we are talking about fundamental transformation of the Eritrean society, the African society, I think it should start from a certain related paradigm that contains three pillars. The first important thing is that the centrality of people with subjective role, not as the object of transformation. The subject role of the people would be very critical and very important. Therefore, people with centrality as a subject, and then responsible participation of people, not nominal, not symbolic, and at the end of the day, it's about empowering the people, creating people's power. Now, if we base ourselves on these three parameters, then the first important thing to look at this issue of creating a critical mass with the necessary attitude is to look at the level of a systemic approach. It doesn't have to be only on leaders, or it doesn't have to be on that side of the segment of the population. It has to be seen in a systemic approach. For me, and if I base myself on the Eritrean experience, the first thing that comes is how can we create a grassroots democratic process viable to the Eritrean context and Eritrean needs? That's the most important thing. It's about trying to empower people so that they become the critical mass. It's not about the rules. It's not about the institutions that you have at high level. So the first thing that comes is how we could create political, social, economic institutions at grassroots level so that democracy becomes intertwined with social justice. And that's what we are trying to do in Eritrea. Of course, there is always talk about Eritrea not being democratic, not having election, the president having not been elected again or whatever. the most important thing for creating viability of the Eritrean society, how we could establish grassroots democratic process, and that grassroots democratic process has to be complemented with institution, community capacity building, so that we have the critical mass for change and transformation. Now, so that's the first issue. The second issue is about cultural revolution. I know the revolution sometimes sounds a bit awkward, but cultural revolution, that means cultural transformation in the society is very important as part of the systemic approach. And that would mean redefining the whole education system and the whole human resource development system in the Eritrean society, so that the people are given with the necessary knowledge, capacity, professional, technical capabilities, and even change their attitude to a significant level. And that's what we tried to do during the liberation struggle. So this is the second element for trying to create a critical mass. And the third important thing is a leadership very close to the heart of the people, in the service of the people, and at the same time free from corruption. We almost have this in Eritrea. So it's not about leaders only. It's not about the technocrats that are in the middle, or even a nominal or symbolic participation of people at the grassroots level. It should be a combination of trying to bring all these three and then have the necessary decisive role of the human factor. That's how we want to see transformation in Eritrea. It's beginning, it's nation building. It's only 20 years since we became independent. We have laid the foundation. It will require time, space, and organization to be consummated. So it's a question of generations. So if it's a question of generations, then the next issue is creating a critical mass is related to a guaranteed future, and a guaranteed future can only be related to upbringing of a new generation, and that's where the youth issue comes. Nation building is about building a new young generation, very critical for a viable development in Eritrea.
So, Professor, I mean, this is, touches on some things you said. It's this generation's responsibility, absolutely. But just kind of alluding to what the governor said, and let me ask you the question, which is, you said, Germany and there's a critical mass and is developed because they had this attitude due to the hyperinflations and the disruptions of never again. Is in Africa, do you feel, as an outsider looking in, that we really are at that point where people feel never again? And how does that influence whether we can or cannot, or how well we're doing in terms of changing attitudes?
I most certainly do. Let me give you an example. I was recently in Uganda, brought in by the Central Bank of Uganda to do an annual public lecture at the Central Bank. And because they've just discovered oil, they asked me to speak on managing oil. I hope this won't give Dr. Sanusi ideas, but frankly, as giving a public lecture at the Central Bank of Uganda I didn't think this was any big deal. By the time I turned up, there was an audience of 2,500, nearly all young, and very, very concerned. The key question was, is this going to destroy us, or is this going to develop us? What do we have to do? What decisions as a society do we have to take? Right? So there's appetite out there amongst young people to pose the questions, and this is a transformation. Young people in Africa have woken up to the fact that their elders are in this awesome position of responsibility, that by the time young people actually get to an age where they have power of decision, it'll be too late. And so yeah, there's an appetite there. I mean, but young people have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to get up to speed on the issues. And sometimes the issues are quite complicated. I mean, that's close to home was the the removal of the petrol subsidy, which, let me assure you, any economist on earth will tell you that petrol subsidy was a crazy waste of money. Right? Any economist on earth. I wrote that in Business Day. I've never had such a tidal wave of abuse. In fact, and that was as of nothing to what the government faced. And what the government needs is a critical mass. What it got was a mass of critics. And they're not the same thing, right? So you've got to, you have a responsibility before you find voice to get up to speed on is this a good idea? Is it what actually was going on is that a government was at last taking a brave decision, and I commend the government for doing that. It shouldn't have been condemned by I understand the suspicions, but it was actually the right thing to do. I can't resist, since Governor Sanusi raised the issue of leadership and the leadership of the World Bank. I almost agree with Governor. Clearly, the American candidate is extremely well qualified, but unfortunately, he's extremely well qualified to be head of the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, that isn't the job
that he's going for.
in hand. Now, but I do have a word of advice that if you go ahead with this common African currency in the near future, then the World Bank is the wrong institution for Africa to lead. Take a lesson from Europe. If you're going to have a common currency, get an African as head of the IMF, because you'll need to borrow from them.